Looking back, it feels like the decline snuck up on us, creeping into our lives in small, forgettable ways. I was always busy running my business. Claire was busy raising Marie, our 4-year-old daughter. On paper, everything was perfect. We had built a life that made people envious. A beautiful wife, a thriving business, a little girl who giggled at the smallest things. We weren't just content. We were happy. At least I thought we were. We used to travel every other month, those kinds of trips that made it seem like we were collecting memories for a future we believed in. Italy in the spring, Thailand in the fall. Claire would always plan the details, hand-picking hotels, finding hidden cafes, mapping out days just the way I liked it. That was how it had been for years. She was thorough in everything, from vacations to home life, and I like to think she found as much comfort in the routine as I did. Then the business started slipping. Nothing drastic at first, just a few quiet months, clients who paid late, deals that fell apart at the 11th hour. It didn't panic me at the time. These things happen, I thought. They're temporary setbacks. But the worry found Claire fast. She was good at hiding it in the beginning, telling me it didn't matter, that we'd be fine. Still, I noticed the way she'd fidget with her phone late at night, lying next to me in bed, scrolling through online shops she no longer purchased from. I knew she was restless. But we'd faced bumps before, and I assumed we'd weather this one too. I was wrong. $5,000 a month. When I mentioned that number to Claire, she just blinked. No reaction. And in that silence, I knew it wasn't going to be enough. That was the first time I saw fear in her eyes. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was subtle, a tightening around the corners of her mouth, a twitch of frustration that she thought I didn't notice. She smiled less after that conversation. She started slipping through my fingers without even realizing it herself. And I made the mistake of telling myself it was only stress. Her changes were subtle, almost imperceptible at first. I'd catch her staring off into space, her lips pressed into a tight line, as if her mind was somewhere far from where she sat. It wasn't long before she started spending less time with us. Family dinners shrank into awkward silences. Claire, once the heart of our home, was out more often, sometimes with friends, sometimes running errands that took too long. I never asked many questions. I assumed she just needed space. She was never cruel, at least not openly. But there were these quiet dismissals, moments that stung more than they should have. When I tried to tell her about my plans to revive the business, she would listen, but her eyes would glaze over as if I were explaining a problem she had no stake in. She was there, physically, but I was starting to feel her absence in ways I couldn't articulate. Marie asked about her too. "Where's Mommy?" She'd ask on those nights when Claire stayed out late. I'd offer excuses. Mommy was busy, Mommy was working hard. But those answers felt hollow even as I said them. And Marie knew it too. The worst part was I still understood her fear. She was scared of the future, scared we wouldn't have the things we once had, the life we'd worked so hard to build. I wanted to tell her we'd be okay, that things would turn around. I wanted to believe it myself. But every time I tried to reach for her, emotionally or physically, she pulled away just enough to let me know she wasn't ready to believe it. Weeks passed, and with each passing day, my business teetered closer to bankruptcy. And Claire drifted further. She became someone I couldn't quite recognize, more restless, more distant. There were nights when she'd leave without saying much, throwing on a dress that seemed too polished for a casual dinner. She never made a big deal about it, just a kiss on the cheek, a half-hearted "I'll be back late." I tried not to overthink it, convincing myself it was nothing. I told myself this was temporary, but deep down I knew. The questions gnawed at me in the quiet hours of the night. Where was she going so often? Who was she with? She didn't volunteer details, and I didn't ask. Maybe I was too afraid of what the answers would be. I wanted to believe she was just blowing off steam, that these nights out were her way of dealing with the stress. I had no proof otherwise, and so I let it slide, even when the knot in my chest grew tighter with each passing evening. Then, the business collapsed for good. Everything I had built, everything I had poured my energy into, it all crumbled within days. Clients backed out, cash flow ran dry, and my employees scattered in search of better opportunities. I sat in my office the day it happened, staring at the empty desks around me, feeling the weight of failure settle in my bones. When I told Claire, she didn't cry. She didn't hug me or offer words of comfort. She simply stared at me for a moment, then nodded, her expression unreadable. She said nothing about how we'd get through this together. There was no reassurance, no promise that we'd rebuild. That night, she went out again. She didn't come back until after 2 in the morning. I was still awake, sitting on the couch, waiting for her, though I wasn't sure what I expected. When she finally walked through the door, she gave me the same tired smile she always did, brushing off my worry with a vague excuse about a friend's birthday party. But the words felt rehearsed, almost mechanical, as though she had been saying them to herself on the way home. That was the moment it clicked. This wasn't just stress. Something had shifted between us, something more profound than financial struggles or personal setbacks. I had tried to hold on to her through the chaos, but it wasn't enough. And now, she was slipping away, piece by piece, night by night. I didn't confront her that night. I just watched as she slipped off her heels and made her way upstairs, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the sinking realization that I was starting to lose the one thing I thought I could always count on: us. The days following the collapse of my business felt surreal, as though I was living in the ruins of a life I no longer recognized. I spent my mornings applying for loans that wouldn't get approved and afternoons making phone calls that went unanswered. It was like grasping at straws, watching everything I built disintegrate while I scrambled to salvage what little dignity I had left. Meanwhile, Claire was drifting further and further away from me, and what scared me most was that it didn't seem accidental. It was in the small things at first. She started staying out later, saying she needed time to think. She stopped touching me. No more quick kisses on the forehead as she passed me in the kitchen. No more fingers brushing mine under the table at dinner. At night, she'd lie stiffly beside me, as if my presence beside her was an inconvenience rather than a comfort. I'd reach out for her sometimes, only to have her murmur something about being tired and roll to the other side of the bed. Marie noticed too. One evening, as we sat in the living room together, Marie curled up beside me, her small arms looped around my neck. "Why doesn't Mommy eat dinner with us anymore?" she asked, her voice soft, the way children speak when they don't yet understand the weight of their questions. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain to a 4-year-old that some questions don't have simple answers? I told her Mommy was busy, that things would get better soon. But the words felt empty, lies meant to soothe her, not the truth. And perhaps I was trying to convince myself, too, that this was just a phase, that Claire's absence from our daily lives was temporary. But deep down, I knew I was losing her, inch by inch, and yet part of me wanted to protect her. I could see the fear behind her eyes, the way she avoided sitting with us for long, the way she always seemed to be mentally somewhere else, even when she was physically present. She wasn't just angry with me, she was terrified. But terrified of what? Our future? The possibility that things would never go back to the way they were? Or was she afraid of something more personal? Something she didn't know how to admit, even to herself? I told myself it was just the pressure. She wasn't used to instability. We had lived well for years, comfortably, with no real financial worries. Now, with the foundation cracking beneath us, maybe she was trying to find solid ground in whatever way she could. I thought I could understand that. Until the night I checked her phone. It was one of those evenings when she left the house dressed too sharply for a casual meetup with friends. She had slipped into a black dress I remembered buying for her birthday the year before, the fabric clinging to her like a second skin. Her perfume, something subtle and floral, lingered in the hallway after she left, like a ghost trailing her. I sat on the couch after she was gone, staring at the empty spot where she had stood. My mind churned with doubts I had tried to bury, thoughts I didn't want to entertain, because admitting them would mean accepting that something was very, very wrong. Then I saw it, her phone on the table. She had left it behind, something she never did. I told myself I wouldn't look, that it would be an invasion of privacy. But temptation clawed at me, each unanswered question from the past few months demanding an explanation. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I unlocked it. At first, everything looked normal. Group texts with her friends, a few notifications from social media. But it was the archived messages that caught my eye. One name stood out, Daniel. Someone I didn't know. The messages weren't explicit, but they didn't need to be. There were jokes that only two people intimately close would share. There were vague hints at plans that didn't involve me. And there it was, buried between the words, the confirmation of a connection she hadn't told me about. I put the phone down, feeling a cold wave of nausea wash over me. My hands trembled as the weight of the discovery settled in. I didn't confront her right away. I told myself I needed more information, more proof, something concrete before I accused her of anything. So I waited. The tension builds. Over the next week, I became a man I no longer recognized. I watched her carefully, tracking her subtle movements, looking for signs that would confirm my worst fears. Every late-night trip, every unexplained errand, every smile that wasn't meant for me, each moment was a thread pulling apart the fabric of the life we had built. One evening, after putting Marie to bed, I decided to confront her, not directly, but gently. I wanted to gauge her reaction, see if there was any truth left between us. "You've been going out a lot lately," I said as we sat at the dinner table, both of us picking at food we didn't have the appetite to eat. She didn't look up from her plate. "Just with friends. It helps me clear my head." I nodded slowly, watching her. "Which friends?" The question was innocent enough, but the way she stiffened told me everything I needed to know. "Does it matter?" she replied, her voice tight, her fork clinking against her plate. It was a simple deflection, but it cut deeper than she realized. I knew in that moment that she wasn't just hiding something, she was hiding someone. Breaking point. The next day, I made a decision. I would follow her the next time she went out. It wasn't something I wanted to do, but I needed answers. Real answers, not the half-truths she had been feeding me for weeks. When Claire left that evening, I waited a few minutes before slipping out behind her. I kept my distance, trailing her car through the dimly lit streets of the city. My heart pounded with every turn she took, every red light that brought me closer to a truth I wasn't ready to face. She drove to an area I didn't recognize, an affluent neighborhood filled with sprawling mansions and neatly manicured lawns. I followed her to the end of a cul-de-sac, where she parked in front of a house that looked more like a palace than a home. I watched as she stepped out of the car, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. She walked to the front door without hesitation, and a man opened it, tall, broad-shouldered, with the easy confidence of someone who knew he had nothing to lose. Claire smiled, a smile I hadn't seen in months, and stepped inside. I stayed in my car, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me like a lead blanket. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I knew, in that moment, that whatever was waiting inside that house wasn't innocent. But I wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. I stayed in the car for what felt like hours, my mind swirling with questions I didn't want answered. The lights in the mansion flickered behind the thick curtains, casting shadows of movement inside. I couldn't see much, just silhouettes, enough to ignite my worst fears. Claire had entered that house without hesitation, as if this place, and whoever was inside, had become familiar to her. Every second I waited felt like a betrayal of myself. But I wasn't ready to charge in. Not yet. I needed to be smart. If I confronted her too soon, she'd deny everything, twist the truth. I needed to know what I was dealing with first. Eventually, I stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting into my skin. I circled the perimeter of the house, heart pounding in my chest as I moved from shadow to shadow. My mind raced. How long had this been going on? Was this a one-time lapse in judgment, or had she been slipping away from me for months? When I found an unlocked gate leading to the backyard, I knew I shouldn't go in. I knew this was the moment where I could turn back, pretend I'd seen nothing, and confront her later when my head was clearer. But something inside me had already shifted. I needed to see the truth with my own eyes, no matter how ugly it was. I crept through the yard, crouching low beneath the windows until I found one cracked slightly open. It led to a side room just off the living area, close enough for me to hear murmurs of conversation. Claire's voice was unmistakable, warm and easy, the way she used to sound with me before everything fell apart. But the sound of her laughter, soft, playful, made my stomach turn. There was another voice too, low and confident, accompanied by the occasional sound of clinking glasses. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was intimate. Too intimate. I pressed closer to the window, my breath shallow and sharp in the cold air. Through a small gap in the curtains, I caught a glimpse of her. Claire was sitting on a leather couch, legs curled beneath her, wine glass in hand. And next to her, a man leaned in close, his hand resting on her thigh like it belonged there. I clenched my fists, the anger rising in me like a tidal wave. I had suspected. God, I had known, but seeing it with my own eyes made it real in a way I hadn't been prepared for. This wasn't just stress or panic about the business. This was something deliberate, something intimate. I stepped back from the window, my mind buzzing with fury, humiliation, and a sickening sense of helplessness. My world had shifted beneath my feet, and I was standing on the edge of something dark, something irreversible. The weight of silence. I didn't confront them that night. I walked back to my car, each step heavy with the realization that the woman I thought I knew, the woman I had loved, was slipping into a world that no longer included me. The drive home was a blur. I couldn't even remember turning the key in the ignition or pulling into the driveway. By the time I reached our house, it was quiet dark. Marie was already asleep, her small form curled up under her blanket, her steady breathing the only sound that kept me tethered to reality. I stood in her doorway for a long time, watching her sleep, trying to absorb some of the innocence she still carried. Claire wasn't there to tuck her in again, and I knew, with a certainty that felt like a knife in my chest, that things would never go back to how they were. That night, I sat in the living room, staring at nothing as the hours ticked by. My mind raced with scenarios, what I would say to Claire when she returned, how I would confront her. But each possibility seemed more futile than the last. She would lie. She would twist the truth, manipulate me into doubting what I had seen. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I had the strength to walk away from her. When the front door finally opened around 2 in the morning, Claire slipped inside as quietly as a thief. She didn't expect me to be awake. Her heels clacked softly against the hardwood as she made her way toward the stairs, barely glancing in my direction. "Late night," I said, my voice rough from hours of silence. She froze, one hand gripping the railing, her head turning slightly toward me. "It was just a friend's birthday," she said, her tone too casual. "I told you I'd be late." I stared at her for a moment, the weight of everything I had seen pressing down on my chest. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to demand the truth right then and there. But another part of me, the part that still remembered the woman I had married, was too tired to fight. "Right?" I muttered, looking away. "A friend's birthday?" She hesitated, as if she wanted to say something more. But in the end, she just nodded and slipped upstairs, leaving me alone in the dark. Doubt takes root. Over the next few days, I tried to pretend things were normal, as if I could somehow will everything back to the way it had been. Claire carried on like nothing had changed, smiling when she needed to, playing the perfect wife when we were around other people. But every time we were alone, the silence between us grew heavier, more suffocating. I watched her closely, looking for cracks in the facade. And they were there, subtle but unmistakable. The way she flinched when I asked where she had been, the way her phone was always turned face down on the table, notifications muted. I tried to confront her gently at first, hoping she would come clean on her own. "Are you okay?" I asked one evening as we sat on the couch, Marie asleep upstairs. "You seem distant lately." She gave me a tired smile, the kind people wear when they're pretending they aren't bothered. "I'm fine," she said softly. "Just a lot on my mind." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. I could see it in her eyes. She was holding something back, something she wasn't ready to tell me. And I knew then that she wouldn't admit anything until I forced her hand. The decision to act. The tension between us grew unbearable. I was walking on a razor's edge, waiting for the moment when everything would snap. Claire continued going out, each absence cutting deeper into the trust one had once taken for granted. And I knew I couldn't live like this much longer. The next time she left the house, I followed her again, but this time I wasn't just gathering information. This time, I was ready to confront her, to demand answers. I tailed her through the city streets, my heart pounding with every turn she took. When she pulled into the same neighborhood, the same mansion as before, I knew this was it. There would be no more waiting, no more doubts. I parked a few houses down, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. This time I wasn't just going to watch from the outside. This time I was going to get the truth. The quiet hum of my car's engine cut off with a twist of the key, leaving only the sound of my pounding heart. My breath came out uneven, sharp in the cold night air. I sat there in the dim glow of the mansion's streetlights, staring at the house that had become a graveyard for my trust. I could feel the rage bubbling beneath the surface, hot, volatile, and unstoppable. I hadn't come here to play the role of the victim any longer. I had to know the truth, even if it shattered what little remained of my life. With a deep breath, I stepped out of the car and walked toward the gate, my footsteps soundless on the pavement. I could hear muffled laughter leaking from the house, the carefree sound of people indulging in a world I no longer belonged to. Every step closer chipped away at my resolve to stay calm. I wasn't even sure what I intended to do when I got inside. Part of me wanted to grab her and demand an answer. Why him? Why like this? But another part, the darker part, only wanted destruction. The side gate swung open with a quiet creak. I slipped into the backyard, sticking to the shadows. My pulse drummed in my ears, louder with each step I took toward the patio doors. The curtains inside were drawn, but the faint glow of chandeliers illuminated a scene I didn't need to see clearly to understand. They were inside, laughing, drinking, talking like they belonged together. And then I saw them, through the thin slit in the curtain. Claire sat on the same man's lap, her head tilted toward his as she whispered something in his ear. He grinned, his arm draped lazily around her waist like it was the most natural thing in the world. My throat burned with the taste of bile, but I swallowed it down. This was it. No more waiting. No more wondering. I yanked the patio door open, the sound shattering the intimacy of the scene like a gunshot. The two of them jerked their heads toward me, stunned for only a moment before Claire's expression twisted, not into guilt, but into annoyance, as if I were the one intruding. "Tom," she said, her voice laced with disbelief, as if I had just stumbled into the wrong house by mistake. The man, lounging beneath her, gave me a slow, arrogant smirk, the kind of grin that told me he'd already won long before I arrived. And that was all it took. The anger I had been holding in for months surged forward, and before I knew what I was doing, I lunged at him, grabbing his shirt and dragging him off the couch. He stumbled, nearly falling, but caught himself with that same smug confidence. "Get your hands off me," he said, laughing, as if I were some pitiful, broken thing. "You think this is funny?" I growled, my voice thick with fury. "You think you can just—" Claire stepped between us, her hands pressed against my chest to push me back. "Tom, stop it. You're embarrassing yourself." I stared at her, stunned. "Embarrassing myself?" I repeated, my voice a low, dangerous whisper. "You've been sneaking around with this guy, behind my back, and I'm the one embarrassing myself?" She didn't even flinch. There was no shame, no regret, just exhaustion, like she was tired of pretending to care. "This is what happens when you have nothing left to offer, Tom," she said, her voice calm, calculated. "You lost the business. You lost your way. And now you want to blame me for finding someone who can actually take care of us?" I stumbled back, the words hitting me harder than any punch. "So that's it, huh?" I whispered. "It was always about the money." Claire didn't deny it. She crossed her arms and glanced at the man behind her, who stood there with his hands in his pockets, watching the scene unfold like it was some kind of entertainment. "I have to think about my future," she said coldly. "And Marie's. You couldn't expect me to stay with someone who can't even keep a roof over our heads." I stared at her, feeling the last pieces of the life I had built crumble to dust. All the memories, the promises, the love, weighed down by one unspoken truth. I had been nothing more than a provider to her, a paycheck with a pulse. "You disgust me," I said quietly, the words carrying the weight of every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, every sliver of pain she had carved into me. Claire's expression didn't change. She had made her decision, and it no longer mattered what I thought of her. "Go home, Tom," she said. "There's nothing left for you here." The breaking point? For a long moment, I stood there, paralyzed by the enormity of the betrayal. But then something shifted inside me, a quiet, dangerous clarity. She thought this was over. She thought she had won. But she didn't know me as well as she thought. Without a word, I turned and left, my fists clenched so tightly my nails bit into my palms. As I walked out into the cold night, a plan began to form in the back of my mind. Dark, twisted, but clear. She had taken everything from me. My marriage, my pride, my future. But she had made one mistake. She underestimated just how far I was willing to go. I climbed into my car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I sat there, the silence pressing in on me like a weight, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't stop. I wasn't going to let them walk away from this. Not without paying for what they'd done. Not without losing everything, just like I had. The night at the mansion was not the end. I wish I could say it was. I wish I could tell you that after confronting Claire and her lover, everything became clear, cut, black and white. But life isn't that simple. Betrayal is rarely clean. It's messy, drawn out, a slow bleed. And in my case, the wound wasn't just deep, it was deliberate. After that first confrontation, I told myself it would stop. She knew I'd caught her, and surely that would put an end to it, right? I wanted to believe that. Needed to. I told myself that even though she didn't love me like she used to, she'd stay for Marie's sake. Maybe we could still fix things. Maybe this was just a moment of weakness on her part. But the lies we tell ourselves are always the most dangerous. For the next few weeks, Claire seemed to settle down. She spent more time at home, cooked dinner for the three of us like old times, even tucked Marie into bed with a kiss on the forehead. I almost believed things were normal again. I wanted to believe it so badly that I ignored the signs. How she still kept her phone hidden. How her eyes never quite met mine. How her touch felt practiced, mechanical. And then it started again. At first, it was the late-night texts. I'd see her phone light up on the nightstand when she thought I was asleep. She would glance at it, her fingers scrolling quickly, her lips twitching into the smallest of smiles before she turned the phone face down. Then came the unexplained dinners with friends that stretched late into the night. Every time, I would ask who she was with, and every time, her answer was different. Names I didn't recognize, places I had never heard of. Once, I asked if she wanted me to join her. I told her Marie was with my sister that evening, that we could have a night out together, just the two of us. Her face faltered, just for a second, before she forced a smile and said, "It's just a girl's thing, Tom. You wouldn't enjoy it." And that was when I knew. This wasn't just one mistake. This wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a pattern. She wasn't trying to rebuild our marriage. She was waiting for something, biding her time, testing how much she could get away with before I broke. And maybe that was the worst part. She knew I wouldn't leave. She knew I loved her too much, that I would take her back even after everything she had done. She didn't respect me. She pitted me, tracking the pattern. I needed to know how far this went, how deep her betrayal really ran. One evening, when Claire left the house for another dinner, I didn't just follow her. I followed her throughout the night. She didn't know I was behind her as she met the same man at the mansion again, laughing as they exchanged kisses at the door. But that wasn't the worst part. After leaving the mansion, she didn't come straight home. She went to a bar, a familiar, upscale place we used to frequent in better days. There, I watched from a corner booth as she met another man. They laughed over drinks, her hand brushing his wrist in that intimate, familiar way she used to touch me. It wasn't just one man. It wasn't just one affair. She was living two lives. The Claire I knew, the Claire I had married, had been gone for months, maybe longer. In her place was a woman I didn't recognize, a stranger who wore my wife's face, but belonged to a world that didn't include me. I sat in that bar, watching her flirt with this second man, feeling the weight of every lie she had told me. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the realization that this had become normal for her. She wasn't just cheating on me. She had built a life outside of our marriage, and I hadn't even noticed until now. I wanted to storm over to her, to drag her out of that bar, to demand an explanation for every late night, every lie, every broken promise. But I didn't. I stayed in the shadows, gripping my drink so tightly I thought the glass might shatter. I needed to be smart about this. The breaking point, the final straw, came a week later. Claire left the house again, but this time she didn't bother with excuses. "I'm going out," she said flatly, not even looking up from her phone as she slipped on her heels. And just like that, she was gone, leaving me alone in the silence of our empty house. I knew where she was going. I knew who she was meeting. This time, I didn't follow her. I didn't need to. I had seen enough. When she returned home around 2 in the morning, I was waiting for her in the living room. She stepped inside, her shoes dangling from one hand, her hair tousled from the night's activities. She didn't even seem surprised to see me sitting there, as if she had been expecting this confrontation all along. "You're home late," I said, my voice low and calm, though every muscle in my body was tense with barely contained rage. She gave a tired shrug, like she couldn't be bothered to lie anymore. "It's not what you think." I stared at her, feeling the weight of all the nights I had stayed awake waiting for her, hoping, praying, that I was wrong. But now, there was no denying the truth. "It never is, Claire," I whispered, more to myself than to her. For a moment, she stood there in silence, her expression unreadable. Then, with a sigh, she said the words that shattered whatever was left of my heart. "I can't do this anymore, Tom. You're not enough." Those words, simple, cruel, final, were the death blow. Claire's words echoed in my mind. "You're not enough." They lingered there, cutting deeper than anything I thought possible. It wasn't just the betrayal of her body. It was the realization that everything we'd built, every promise, every shared moment, had been nothing more than a transaction in her mind. When I stopped being useful, I stopped being wanted. She didn't even seem angry or regretful, just indifferent, as if she was finally telling me something she had known for months but never bothered to say aloud. And that indifference, more than anything else, was what shattered me. I sat there, my hands gripping the edge of the couch, staring at the woman I once thought I'd grow old with. She was waiting for me to say something, anything, but there was nothing left to say. She had already left me, long before this moment, long before I discovered the truth. "Go to bed, Tom," she said, exhausted, as if I were the one making things difficult. And just like that, she turned away, leaving me sitting alone in the dark. The plan takes shape. I sat there for hours after she disappeared upstairs. I could hear the soft creak of the bed frame as she crawled under the sheets we once shared. She had no idea that this was the moment everything would change, that the person she thought she had broken was already gone. I thought about Marie, thought about what kind of life we were giving her. A daughter growing up in a home filled with unspoken betrayals and lies, in the shadow of a marriage that was already dead. I owed her more than that. She deserved more than Claire's half-hearted attention and my quiet suffering. And that's when the clarity came. I knew what I had to do. It wasn't revenge for the sake of it. I had no interest in petty payback. I wanted to make sure that Claire and her lovers felt the same weight of loss that I had carried. I wanted to burn down everything she had built, just as she had burned down what we once had. Execution. The next day, I put the final pieces of my plan in motion. I went through Claire's phone. She didn't even bother to hide her passwords anymore. I found exactly what I needed: bank records, names, messages that painted a picture far darker than I expected. She wasn't just seeing these men. She was financially tied to them, businesses, investments, schemes I hadn't known about. They had built their lives around her the way I once had, and I was about to tear it all down. I took copies of everything, enough to implicate her and her lovers in more than just infidelity. Fraud, tax evasion, deals that would put them all under investigation for years. I spent the rest of the afternoon making anonymous reports, sending emails to banks, forwarding incriminating documents to the authorities. Claire thought she could leave me behind and start over with someone new. But when the dust settled, she wouldn't have anything left. The last goodbye. That night, I came home to find Claire sitting on the couch, sipping a glass of wine as if nothing had changed. She looked up when I entered, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. Just another reminder that she had long stopped caring. I want you to leave, I said, my voice steady calm. Claire blinked, her wine glass pausing midair. Excuse me? You heard me. I gestured toward the door. Pack a bag. You're done here. She laughed, a short, sharp sound. You can't kick me out, Tom. This is my house, too. Not anymore. She stared at me, trying to gauge if I was serious. I didn't blink. What are you talking about? I smiled, cold and deliberate. By morning, you'll understand. But you won't have anywhere to go. Her confidence wavered, just slightly, as she realized I wasn't bluffing. She opened her mouth to argue, but for the first time, words failed her. There was nothing left for her to manipulate, no emotion left for her to twist. Without another word, I turned and walked upstairs, leaving her sitting there in stunned silence. Freedom. The next morning, she was gone. When I came downstairs, the house felt strangely quiet, like the first breath after being held underwater for too long. I saw her suitcase near the door, a few of her things missing from the closet. And that was it. No final argument, no tearful goodbye. Just absence. A few days later, I heard through mutual friends that Claire's accounts had been frozen. The authorities were investigating her and her partners for fraud. Her lovers had cut ties with her the moment things began to unravel. The new life she had built crumbled faster than she could have imagined. I sold the house soon after. Marie and I packed our things and moved to a new place. A fresh start, far away from the wreckage Claire had left behind. I poured everything I had into rebuilding, not just financially, but emotionally. I wasn't the man I used to be, but I was someone better, stronger, someone who knew exactly what he wanted. I devoted myself to Marie, determined to give her the kind of life that didn't depend on deceit or broken promises. Half of my income went toward building a future for her, a future that no longer involved Claire. And as the weeks turned into months, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The aftermath. Claire tried to reach out eventually. She called, left messages, even showed up at Marie's school once. But there was nothing left to say. I had given her everything, and she had thrown it away. She begged for forgiveness, for a second chance, saying she had made a mistake. But I knew better. Claire wasn't sorry for what she had done. She was sorry that she had lost. And I wasn't going to let her back into my life. When I saw her one final time, standing outside my new house, looking desperate, lost, I closed the door without a word. She didn't deserve anything more. In the end, Claire's betrayal had broken me, but it also set me free. And as I watched her walk away for the last time, I knew one thing for certain. I would never be a prisoner to someone